So, Black Panther Wakanda Forever is the sequel to 2018's Black Panther. And this is definitely a much anticipated sequel, but it's also probably the most intriguing for deciding where you go next with Black Panther and the Wakandan lore. And it's mostly just because Chadwick Boseman died, and so the big question became, well, what do you do with Black Panther 2? What do you do? Do you recast Chadwick Boseman in the role of T'Challa after his death? Do you address the death? Which route do you go with it? And who do you have take on the mantle of Black Panther as well? And I'm so glad that that director Ryan Coogler found a way to just be very, very honest with this type of film and make it a very like emotionally moving piece that addresses Boseman's death and also develops a story around it as well. Like it feels a lot like, this is gonna sound like a weird comparison, but it felt like a lot when on Sesame Street they had Mr. Hooper, the character who played him died, and rather than like write him out of the show or recast him, they addressed his death and made it common and canon, and actually weaved it into a heartfelt story about life and loss. And it's very much the same thing with Wakanda Forever here. Wakanda Forever definitely, it addresses that T'Challa did die from a disease that they didn't get to in time, that it seems like he hid from there. So there's definitely a lot of like personal personal effects that are put into this film about, you know, how much his death affected everyone. And in many ways, this is a little bit, I understand it's a little bit like tenuous, but it also kind of plays into how to develop a film in phase 4 of the MCU after, how do you follow up after like Avengers Endgame? And because after that film, it felt like it was such a culmination, then you got so much, and then where do you go from there? And that's very much what Wakanda Forever is about, is, what's the next route that you take? So like right away, I like the fact that it skips about like a year, like they address T'Challa's death, but then they go about a year later where Wakanda is now still struggling to, maintain their space on the international stage. They want to work with people, but they're not willing to open up to other nations that want to steal their vibranium, which of course they could do dangerous stuff with. And it seems like they're making the right call. Angela Bassett returns as Ramonda, who is the queen of Wakanda and now assumes the full duties of running it. But she's a little bit, she's hesitant, but she's still she's come to terms with her grief about T'Challa and tried to learn to move on and take on a position of leadership to basically continue leading her people and defending her people. Who hasn't moved on from his death is Shuri, played by Letitia Wright. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. She's the sister of T'Challa, and she hasn't gotten over his death. Like, there's a pretty blatant scene where it says, no, I'm not ready to move on yet. And it's one of those, she's in, that stage of grief where she's at, the denial portion, where she feels like she doesn't feel anything for his death, like she has moved on, that she doesn't have to think about it, but it is still weighing on her mind, and it is a part, of the grieving process that she still has to process. Unfortunately, she has to process it really quick because there's a new problem with Wakanda. They're holding their own fine against outside forces, but then they have a new enemy on the horizon, which is Namor, who's played in the film by Tenoch Huerta. I'm going to mispronounce his name here, but I'm sorry. Tenoch Huerta Magia, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, the king of Talokan, which is an underwater kingdom that has remained hidden for all these years. And unfortunately, it's been unearthed when the CIA mucks about and, in their means of trying to find vibranium anywhere they can, they stumble upon this empire and they get violent. Like the people who've lived there underwater, just they don't want to be seen and they don't want their vibranium touched. So they're much, much more violent. And you immediately see an interesting parallel between Wakanda and Talokan. So both kingdoms, they want to be protective. They're fearful of outsiders. They have a history of, having experiences with slavery and colonizers that makes them very distant. So it seems like they would have like a good allyship. Of course, they have much different ideas of how to defend their territory. Wakanda has resorted more towards, nonviolent takedowns so they can have prisoners to hold them accountable. Whereas Talokan, Talokan. I keep mispronouncing for some reason. Whereas with Talokan, they're very violent. They, like, if anyone gets anywhere near them, they want their secrets to remain secret, so they kill anybody who gets near them. And they actually have some pretty creative means of doing that. Like, they have the old-fashioned ways of just stabbing people with spears, and more creative ways, like using a bit of a siren song to manipulate them into drowning themselves in the ocean, which is pretty surreal. But like, there's a pretty horrific sequence where they show just how dangerous they can be. And Shuri and Namor end up clashing as like the representatives of their communities and showing like the many sides of what they're concerned about. Like, it's not just that Talokan is like the enemy that they've got to face here. As Shuri learns more about them, as she gets to learn Namor's history and his people, he gets to see that, they're not so different than us. It's just that they have different means of being protective, and those means might actually clash with Wakanda as well. So it presents this interesting idea of, what if Wakanda is presented with a similar kingdom that has like similar pathos and familiar problems to them, but how do they approach that? How can they have allyship if they do not trust each other and the wounds they have still haven't healed yet? And it plays a very interesting part in, like, how to come to terms with revenge, as well as realizing the emptiness of just trying to, like, strike back and kill all those who get in your way. And in terms of, like, its emotional core and its general themes, I feel like that works really well. Like, this is definitely a film that has its central focus on this aspect of legacy and vengeance and loss, and it has a firm focus. Like, I fully expected it to kind of like trip over its own heels in the third act, where it has to have that superhero fight sequence where everyone is fighting each other and there's explosions and killing and violence and all that. And thankfully it doesn't. It actually, like, I had a really good feeling going into the third act once we get to that climax, based on Shuri's motivations. It makes sense for, the route that they're going to take. It's like, oh, okay, there's definitely a big lesson that's going to be learned here, and I definitely looked forward to when it happened. Where I feel the film fumbles is, and everyone will admit this will be the biggest nitpick that everyone has with the film, it's overstuffed. It has so much going on, and so much of it, like, there are huge chunks of it that feel like they're diced up, and like they don't play as big a role. Like a key character who plays a little bit of a role, more or less as a negotiating pawn in this War of Kingdoms, is Riri Williams, played by Dominique Thorne. And at first, like, I was getting excited to see this character because, like, it felt like she was going to be the fish out of water, everyman character who was going to be able to react to everything with Talokan and Wakanda and just be, like, amazed and stunned by it and have these very human reactions, whereas, everyone in Wakanda and everyone in Talokan are very, they're very used to it. Like, the Wakandans are used to all this cool future tech, and the Talokans are used to underwater settings and these cool little aspects of their kingdom. So you'd think there'd be a lot more scenes with Riri reacting to that. And sadly, there's not as much. Like, there's a few scenes, and she definitely has some great chemistry with Shuri, and especially with Okoye, played by I'm gonna mispronounce her name again, with Denai Guerrera, and they have, like, the three of them have, like, perfect chemistry. That I love the fact that in the first act there's a whole chase sequence with just them, like, just like realizing they've been set up and trying to get ahead of the authorities. There's a real fun chase between them where they've got great back and forth. I wish there were more scenes like that, because it feels like Riri doesn't have that much to do within the story, that she's kind of like diced up a lot more than I would like her to be, especially when you get to the climax and it just kind of like it inexplicably just cuts around to show you, like, oh yeah, actually, yeah, I remember Riri Williams from the comics. She's actually, Ironheart, a bit of the continuation of Iron Man, and she just kind of just like they do foreshadow her suit, but the way that they edit her into the climax is kind of like, oh yeah, Ironheart's here too, just in case you didn't know. Yeah, a little bit of a chaotic editing, and also probably the least involved character you have is Everett Ross, played by Martin Freeman, returning to the role, which like Ross is kind of like more of like a go-between character here. Like he's still like a good contact for Wakanda, especially with what's going on in the CIA, and for like about like I'd say like a little over half the film, it definitely has this angle of a spy thriller where it feels like he's a great player to have in this type of story. Unfortunately, Ross kind of gets forgotten about for most of the narrative, and you only get like tiny scenes of him in between where he has to deliver information to the Wakandans and also cover his butt with the CIA, especially since like we get a lot more scenes with, I don't know how big of a spoiler this will be, but Julia Louis-Dreyfus turns up again as Valentina, who you might remember. She was at the end of Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and she was at the end of Black Widow, and she's in this as well in a few scenes. But if you're hoping for a bigger divulgement of her character or what she's doing exactly, you won't get much of that. Like, they reveal a little bit more of her personal history, but like only a tiny chunk. Like, it feels like we're only getting little bits and pieces of her here and there. Not to mention, Ross's story just kind of like peters out, where he practically, like, aside from like divulging information, he's mostly like, distant from everything going on with Wakanda and Talokan. He's mostly just a contact, and it's like it almost kind of feels like he's in like a different movie that just kind of got spliced in, because like on one hand you do have this very grand fantasy epic about loss and legacy, and then on the other side you got a spy thriller which it feels like Ross would be a better fit for, and you don't get as much of him. He doesn't play that much of a role here. I will say though, we do get a lot more of Winston Duke in the role of M'Baku, the warrior, and with his like group of warriors like the Howl, and he knows how to seal a scene. Like, Winston Duke has always been a great actor, and like here he's given a lot more to work with. So I'm glad that if any of the returning characters are going to get more screen time and stuff to do, I'm glad it's him. It would have been a little bit nice to expand on Lupita Nyong'o's character of Nakia, who's a little bit absent from the film, only for a little bit, just because like it feels like she does play a heavier emotional role in the second half of the film. I would have liked a little bit with her, but for the scenes we do get with her, they're kind of perfect. And I guess I should kind of preference this film with like the tone, because this felt like a much different type of film when you compare it to everything else within phase 4 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Like, and I know that this has kind of always been like the big draw of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is that they always have different types of films. Like when we had Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, we got a horror film. When we got I guess with Thor, we got a little bit like of a fantasy sci-fi element. And here we definitely have like a fantasy war kingdom type story about like kings and queens and princesses and stuff like that. And it definitely does, like, it feels like it has the similar beats as Black Panther, especially when you see Shuri kind of like, maneuver her way up to the throne and kind of like learn her lessons the hard way. Like, you're definitely going to see a lot of parallels between what T'Challa went through in Black Panther and what Shuri goes through in Wakanda Forever. And in some aspects, some people might find that repetitive, but I actually kind of found it interesting how Shuri's ascension was much more rocky. Like, it felt like T'Challa had to challenge the kingdom, and here it feels like Shuri has to challenge herself. Like, I don't want to give there is like an interesting twist on what happens on a certain ceremony that has to go on with the Black Panther. You get to see that again in Wakanda Forever, but it has like a much different meaning and a much more like gut punch of a scene, just with like the way it's set up and what it implies and the character that they reveal for that moment. It creates this much more rockier road for like Shuri to build herself up, which actually makes her hero's journey a lot more interesting, with her trying to ascend to power but also realize that she has to find a better way to lead instead of just challenging like the structures to like become a ruler. Here she is like actually being in the control of a ruler and trying to figure out not to make the same mistakes as before. And just like everyone, I think, does a really good job with their performances here. Especially like I know like this is a crowded cast that barely anyone has a lot of time to get to see them. But for like the scenes they do have, like they're very trimmed, they're very focused. For the more emotional scenes, there were, like, to be fair, there are a few scenes where it feels like they were cutting a little bit quick. But I mean, this film's almost 3 hours, so I mean you would have to like dice it up a little bit here and there. But the biggest thing I want to focus on is just the whole tone of the film. It definitely has an emotional resonance where it feels like it's trying to take itself much more seriously. Like there are a few jokes here and there, but they're kind of like, as they come jokes. There's never a moment where it feels like someone's trying way too hard to make a joke land, or they're just throwing quips at the wall as much as they can. It always feels like there's like a decent moment. It's like, okay, here's a little moment where you can balance it out with a little bit of humor and then get back to the more like serious problem here of like warring kingdoms. So like it takes itself seriously, but not too seriously. Like if the one thing you've been desiring from Phase 4 was a film that took itself a lot more seriously, which I don't know why you would with all like the weird characters that are in the MCU. This is definitely that film, which is saying a lot for a Marvel movie where you have Namor, a character who he's pronounced Namor in the film, but I've always said Namor for some reason. Who, especially with Namor in the film, he has wings on his feet. And yet, like, that's one of the cool things about like Marvel films and like with Star Wars films, is that they always have these weird elements, but they're told in such a way where you can buy into the weirdness. And I think that definitely works with this film. And like the big thing, I don't know how much of a spoiler this is, but I've kind of been getting tired of like of mid-credit scenes, just because like I always feel like they act more like commercials and teases, like, what's going to happen in the next film, like what villain are they going to fight next, or what hero is going to come and work with this bigger ensemble. And there's nothing like that in Wakanda Forever. There is a mid-credit scene, but it's actually a pretty emotionally powerful and perfect way to conclude the film, that it's actually probably one of my favorite mid-credit scenes, just because it doesn't feel like a tease. Like it definitely gives you like hope for like, what's going to happen next with Wakanda and whatever Marvel film will address it next. But it doesn't feel like it's cheap. It feels like there was a reason for that scene to be there, and that it wasn't just, it didn't feel like it was just shoved in there, by Marvel Studios to sell the next film. Like, I mean, like it should be enough that at the end of the film they just say, yes, Black Panther will return in whatever other project we do. So it's very, like, I think this film, like, it's not as good as 2018's Black Panther, and I think that's only because there's a little bit too much going on. It definitely didn't need to be almost 3 hours long for the story it's trying to tell here. But for the majority of the beats that it's trying to hit here, I feel like it really hits home in a lot of scenes, especially when it wants to pay tribute to Chadwick Boseman by the end. I feel like it did it in an actual tasteful way. Rather than just being like a simple, like, in memory of Chadwick Boseman, or, having the Marvel Studios logo just show nothing but Black Panther clips, which the film, it does all that, but it realizes it's not enough. It realizes it needs to weave T'Challa into the story to make it feel like there is a sense of loss and there is a sense of moving on. And for trying to traverse that kind of like rocky road for this type of film, I think Coogler actually does an exceptional job, and even with as messy as it is at times in this film, like, and definitely, like, there's definitely a lot of CGI, especially with like the Talakoans with like their blue skin, and they use like whales to transport themselves all over the ocean, and you have this very chaotic naval battle with like lots of CGI going on here. For all that messiness, I feel like the bigger story here never loses focus. And just like it works so well for like the like the emotional resonance that you want out of this story, with warring kingdoms and fantasy creatures and and divided tribes and lineages, and coming to terms with loss and rising to power and taking on the throne. All these aspects work so well, and just Coogler's direction is just spot on with just great sets, perfect soundtrack, and a wonderfully just great Afrofuturism in general. So it's not as good as Black Panther, but it's still, I think, for this type of sequel, it's pretty damn stellar.